It was 30 years ago this month that the wrestling world changed forever. In an effort to compete directly with the World Wrestling Federation, media mogul Ted Turner gave WCW EVP Eric Bischoff a primetime spot on Monday nights to try and take viewers away from Monday Night Raw. Thus, Nitro was born. For 288 weeks, WCW played every unique hand they could to get ratings. They even held a strong lead over Raw for 83 of them in a row. And although the show would ultimately become a punchline in the wrestling world before WCW's closure in March of 2001, it still holds a place of high regard for wrestling fans of a certain age. Let's face it, if only a couple of things back then went differently, the wrestling scene today would not be the same as it is now. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I guess, is up for debate. But in an alternate timeline, we might have been celebrating the Netflix debut of Nitro this year. That's how close it felt at times. Books, TV shows, podcasts, documentaries, and yes, even humble YouTube channels have spent the last 24 years piling the dirt on WCW's flagship show, highlighting all the bad things about it. And don't worry, we'll certainly cover that soon enough. But to honor the landmark anniversary of Nitro storming onto the scene and shifting the balance of power in professional wrestling, what better way to celebrate than with some positives? This week, I'm going to rank them, my picks for the top 8 best moments in WCW Nitro history. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Hit that bell icon to get more stuff like this, because on this channel, WCW lives forever. Number 8, Ric Flair vs. Sting, the final Nitro. We begin appropriately at the end, March 26, 2001, Panama City Beach, the last episode of WCW Nitro. Throughout all the company's highs and lows, there were two tried and true stars whose reputations remained sterling even after years of terrible booking, the Nature Boy and the Stinger. So it was very fitting that the final main event in Nitro history would be between them. The show began with Flair delivering an impassioned promo, calling out Vince McMahon for trying to monopolize the wrestling business and for diminishing the careers of anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of wrestling before he challenged the Stinger to one last showdown, a bookend to the match they had on the very first Nitro. Flair was famously going through a crisis of confidence at the time, to the point where he wrestled most of his final WCW matches with a shirt on or even fully dressed. And while the match was hardly Clash of the Champions caliber, it was a nice, comforting swan song that would be the 112th of 113 recorded matches the two had with each other. Number 7, the man of 1,004 holds. One of the few things that almost everyone can agree on about WCW's demise is that there was an impermeable glass ceiling that kept so many promising acts mired in the undercard. Without that investment in the future, WCW's fate was sealed once many of the old guard were being phased out. As we've discussed before on the channel, one of those mid-card acts who stood out in spite of his circumstances was Chris Jericho. After debuting as a white meat babyface in the fall of 1996, things really got interesting when he turned heel about a year and a half later. Leaning more into comedy and hair metal references, he was exploring the limits of what a cowardly heel could pull off, and his character was arguably solidified on the March 30th, 98 episode of Nitro. After beating Marty Jannetty, Jericho finally burst out from the Shawn Michaels mold by producing a list.
But I know 1,004, and I wrote them all down. Here we go.
Taking a shot at his rival Dean Malenko's Man of 1,000 Holds moniker, the Lionheart took the act a step further, pulling out a massive length of old printer paper with all of his known moves, just a few more than that of Malenko's.
Number 5, the Saskatchewan spinning nerve hold.
Get him out of the ring.
I can.
Yeah, but you've got to announce.
From the arm bar to the arm drag to the arm bar and everything in between, the Ayatollah of rock and roll kept reading the list through an entire commercial break before finally being cut off by the next match. But by then, Jericho had officially emerged as a top act to watch. And sure enough, nearly 30 years later, the multiple-time world champ has been hailed as a creative powerhouse who has refused to rest on his laurels, constantly trying new ways to get the fans' attention, including, among other things, a different kind of list. Number 6, Sting fades to black. As I mentioned a couple of entries back, when you think of WCW, you often think of Ric Flair and Sting. But while Flair did have a brief run in the WWF during the 1990s, Sting remained with the Turner family until the bitter end. For all his accomplishments, the Stinger embodied what it truly meant to be a franchise player. So it was quite a shock on the September 9th, 1996 episode of Nitro, when, after being lured out to the parking lot, Lex Luger found himself supposedly jumped by his best friend, and the man responsible for him returning to WCW, the Stinger himself. Could it be? Could Mr. WCW really be joining up with the NWO? Now, you would think that for all the ups and downs these two friends had been through, including, Luger turning on him in '92, that Lex would give his buddy the benefit of the doubt. But tensions were high as the NWO continued their takeover, and now there was no trust. I know it wouldn't have been very riveting television, but does nobody in this world know what making a phone call is, to clear things up? Sting finally proved his loyalty at Fall Brawl when he stormed the War Games cage, demolished the New World Order by himself, then told Lex and the rest of Team WCW to go pound sand before abandoning the match. On the following Nitro, Sting began the biggest evolution to his career to date. In a speech that seemed to contain some shootier elements, Sting cut his entire promo with his back symbolically turned to the hard cam. He ran down all the people he'd been there for over the years, those who now doubted his allegiance. Sting then declared himself a free agent, speaking his last words on WCW for well over a year. This was the era in which the brightly colored characters of the 80s and 90s began to get with the times and go dark and edgy, and Sting's gradual transition into his Crow variant is one of the biggest examples of that. Like Hogan's turn to the dark side, Sting's new look gave him a breath of life, almost splitting his career into two distinct phases. While the ultimate blow-off at Starrcade turned out less than perfect, Sting's slow transformation to the black and white is one of the reasons the character remains an all-time favorite to this day. Number 5. Lex Luger beats Hollywood Hogan. Nitro certainly wouldn't have gotten off the ground without the signing of Hulk Hogan in 1994, but by that point, the Hulkster was deep in the end stage of his big babyface era. Fast forward to Bash the Beach 96, when Hogan agreed to turn heel and join the New World Order with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, no doubt adding years to his career in the process. By August of '97, Hollywood Hogan was not only the biggest star in wrestling again and largely responsible for its reboom in popularity, he also had a death grip on the WCW title for more than a year. And while Sting stayed up in the rafters, it was time for another hero to emerge. After years of failing to meet his potential as a top babyface, Lex Luger's popularity took off like a rocket in '96 and '97 as one of the leaders in the fight against the NWO, partly because he was one of the few babyfaces at the time not booked like a total idiot. Yeah, sometimes that's all it takes. The total package earned a title shot against Hogan at Road Wild '97, but as part of WCW's tactics in the ratings war at the time, they decided to give the match away for free on Nitro instead. And make no mistake, it was an awesome match, and the fans on that night were better off for having seen it. Luger forced Hogan to submit for the first time to the human torture rack, as even referee Pee Wee Anderson couldn't help but pop for the finish. The evening ended with a mass of WCW wrestlers swarming the ring to celebrate with their hero, the man who finally knocked the evil Hogan off his perch. Unfortunately, the impact of Luger's reign was negated less than a week later, as Hogan would beat Lex in a rematch for the belt at the pay-per-view and would hold on to it until Starrcade that December. It wouldn't have killed them to have Luger hold on to it a little longer, but Lex's title victory remains one of the most shocking and satisfying moments in the history of the Monday Night War, a rare triumph for WCW in the war with the NWO. It almost makes you wonder how much longer the good times could have lasted if they had more of those happy moments. Number 4, the Owen Hart tribute match. While Bret Hart's standout moments in WCW were few and far between, this one may perhaps be the most bittersweet. On May 23, 1999, Bret's brother Owen fell to his death at the WWF's Over the Edge pay-per-view in Kansas City. For at least one day, the invisible lines of dissent between the WWF and WCW were dissolved by tragedy, as both companies gave an outpouring of tributes to one of the most beloved members of any locker room he was in. The Hitman was already on hiatus to heal from injury, and Owens' passing pushed his return back even further. Nevertheless, Eric Bischoff allowed Bret to go out with a live mic on the July 6th Nitro to speak his mind about the tragedy. Then on October 4th, in the same building where Owen had passed away, a match was made between Hart and fellow Dungeon alum Chris Benoit, a contest dedicated to the memory of Owen, emceed by the former world champion Harley Race. There's really not that much else to say about it. If you hear the names Bret Hart and Chris Benoit in a matchup, you know it's going to be good, and that's certainly what it was. It's worth taking the time to relive this classic bout that was not only arguably the last great moment of Bret's in-ring career, but also a fitting tribute to the memory of the King of Hearts. Number 3, The Outsider's Attack. One thing that mainstream wrestling was sorely lacking in the mid-90s was a sense of realism. If the WWF and their gang of wrestling plumbers, hog farmers, or evil dentists wasn't doing it for you, all you had to do was switch over to WCW for a healthy dose of Dungeon of Doom wackiness, Evad Sullivan and his pet rabbit, or Gary Spivey from the Psychic Friends Network reassuring Paul Orndorff that he was still wonderful.
I know you're not okay.
You did?
Yes.
How did you know that?
I got a vision. Psychics know.
Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, ECW was doing an edgy wrestling version of a Quentin Tarantino movie, and Eric Bischoff seemed to understand that that was the way forward. But it wasn't until Scott Hall and Kevin Nash sauntered in from the WWF in the summer of '96 that Bischoff was able to ape Paul Heyman's style to perfection, complete with a big-budget sheen. After weeks of outsider attacks and the shocking revelation of Hulk Hogan as the third man, things got even more grim on the July 29, '96 episode of Nitro. The prime defenders of WCW, Sting, Lex Luger, and Randy Savage, were in the midst of a six-man tag team match with the Horsemen, when suddenly Jimmy Hart appeared, frantically imploring everyone to stop fighting and follow him to the back, as if he were Lassie and Timmy had fallen down the mine shaft.
And this is not a Dungeon of Doom ploy.
Yeah, this is not the place for a Dungeon of Doom.
This is serious business here. Look at him.
After some desperate insistence, all 6 wrestlers followed Hart to the back, where Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were brutalizing members of the roster with baseball bats. Nobody was safe, especially Rey Mysterio, who was famously lawn darted into the side of a trailer by Nash. It only lasted a couple of minutes, but the NWO's beatdown left huge shockwaves across WCW. For the remainder of the show, Nitro abandoned its traditional format and focused on the aftermath in the backstage area, a space that had largely been kept out of public view until that point. Women sobbed over the carnage as angry wrestlers swore revenge. This felt about as serious and real as one could get at the time. Looking back, you can definitely see influences of places like Florida and Memphis and Mid-South when you see an angle like this play out, but nothing had ever been done like this on a national level before. And after this, the lines were blurred forever. The NWO and their thug tactics helped propel the art form into the future and injected a much-needed dose of realism to an industry that had been lost in the sauce trying to recapture the magic of the 80s. Number 2, the Four Horsemen reunite. For all the times WCW tried to shake him, they just could not get rid of Ric Flair. By the late 1990s, he was considered a wrestling institution who had to be protected at all costs. Well, most people thought that of him except for Eric Bischoff, apparently. Flair and Bischoff's relationship in WCW was complicated, to say the least. The Nature Boy had given a lot of himself to the company, going back to the Crockett days. He helped Bischoff sign Hulk Hogan. He even briefly retired to try and get the fans to stop booing Hulk. Despite all this, it seemed that Nate just couldn't earn respect from Eazy-E. The final straw came in April of '98 when Flair refused to work a Thunder taping because he'd already been cleared to miss the show so he could attend his son Reed's wrestling tournament. In what turned out to be a huge overreaction, Bischoff suspended and sued Flair, and even held an all-staff meeting to declare he would make it his life's mission to bankrupt the multiple-time world champ. This was around the same time when Eric was also publicly challenging Vince McMahon to a fight on pay-per-view, so yeah, he probably wasn't operating with all of his faculties at the moment. After months of acrimony, the legal issues were finally settled, and Flair made his long-awaited return to Nitro live that September in the heart of Horseman country, Greenville, South Carolina. Speaking of the Horsemen, they were back together for the first time in nearly a year after Flair disbanded the group while recovering from Curt Hennig's betrayal at the 1997 War Games.
I almost forgot the Fourth Horseman, Ric Flair, go down here!
For the hardcore fans of WCW, it was a euphoric rush, a surge of validation to see the Horsemen back together, Ric Flair back on their screen. After a difficult 5 months of legal strife, a tearful Flair thanked the fans before going ballistic on Bischoff on the live mic.
Fire me! I'm already fired!
The chaos caused by Bischoff disrupting the proceedings and Flair's subsequent meltdown was one of the most real and emotional segments WCW produced at the time. It's too bad that this moment was born out of something wholly unnecessary, a result of the ego and the dysfunctionality that took over Bischoff as the Federation's comeback was being felt at full force. By this point, many of WCW's choices were looking more jumbled and disorganized than before, and things were beginning to look dark for the company. Thankfully, they still had one bright beacon of hope that lay ahead. But first, we're going to rattle off a few honorable mentions to round out this list. The first Nitro. Obviously, we need to show love to the one that began it all, the inaugural Nitro at the Mall of America. On a week that saw them air unopposed, WCW premiered their hot new endeavor with guns blazing. I figured it would have been trite and too easy to put it on the main countdown because, duh, how are you going to top something as big as WCW poaching Lex Luger from the WWF?
What in the hell is he doing here?
It can't be said enough just how big this moment was for WCW. The Luger acquisition was a huge coup for Bischoff after the WWF let Lex's contract with them expire. It was a well-guarded secret that helped set the tone for the show going forward. Combined with the iconic setting, the fantastic opening match with Brian Pillman and Jushin Liger, and of course a big ol' helping of Pastamania, that makes this an all-time moment in wrestling television history. The first Nitro let the world know that they meant business when doing battle against the WWF. Bret Hart outsmarts Bill Goldberg. Some things last forever, like diamonds, some of the worst people on the internet, and of course Bret Hart's hatred for Bill Goldberg. This goes back way before Starrcade 99. After a shaky 1998 that saw Bret turn back and forth enough times to make the Big Show blush, he returned to Nitro in March of '99. Bret called out Bill Goldberg and goaded the man into spearing him. But then to everyone's shock, somehow Bret got up before the former world champion and symbolically pinned him. Then as Bret recovered, he revealed a steel plate strapped to his torso, a trap set by the Hitman. It was an ingenious heel move that wound up delighting the Toronto crowd. Though it seemed that for many years after Montreal, if Bret didn't have bad luck, he'd have had no luck at all. The segment ended with him announcing he was quitting the company, a way to write him off to recover from injury, only for his brother Owen to tragically pass away, extending his sabbatical from the ring. His feud with Bill Goldberg would eventually be restarted that winter, but unfortunately, Bret wasn't wearing a steel helmet that night in Washington, D.C. Diamond Dallas Page outsmarts the NWO. You know, the more I think about it, the more I realize just how much I enjoy seeing heels getting duped. It's one of my favorite bits. It feels good to see them get what for. Considering his real-life friendships with Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Eric Bischoff, DDP seemed like a natural addition to the New World Order. Well, that and the fact the group was adding just about everybody at the time. Instead, WCW went the other direction and made him one of the most clever babyfaces alive. It began on a January '97 episode of Nitro, where after several weeks of recruitment efforts, it looked like Dally had finally decided to join the pack, before downing Hall with a diamond cutter and beginning his trademark move of fleeing through the crowd. By the spring of that year, it was Randy Savage's turn to deal with this NWO nuisance, but again, DDP was one step ahead. In a classic switcheroo, Page traded places with the luchador La Parka, allowing our hero to hit another diamond cutter out of nowhere. And my pick for the best moment in WCW Nitro history is Goldberg beats Hollywood Hogan. While WCW had a bad rap for making new stars, that wasn't entirely true. They did make stars. It just so happens some of it happened by accident. Dismayed with the WWF's presentation of Ken Shamrock as just another wrestler after his initial debut, Eric Bischoff set his mind to creating a martial arts wrestling hybrid character of his own. No, a different martial arts wrestling hybrid character. Eric had found his huckleberry in Bill Goldberg, a former Atlanta Falcon who'd made the jump to pro wrestling after his football career came to an end. Slowly but surely, Goldberg grew to become one of the hottest acts in the company with his short, impactful matches and his impressive win streak. By the spring of '98, he'd become one of the biggest beacons of hope that WCW had in about forever, and it was obvious to everyone that there was only one dragon left for him to slay. As the summer crept in, Hollywood Hogan was firmly back on top as world champ. But on the July 6, 1998 episode of Nitro, Bischoff seemed destined to prove that WCW was still going strong. With a huge Nitro coming up at the Georgia Dome in Goldberg's hometown of Atlanta, this was an opportunity that Bischoff couldn't pass up. With assurances the favor would be returned later, Hogan agreed to drop the WCW World title, which would make the live crowd happy, which would make the Turner execs in the building that night happy. After Goldberg mowed through Scott Hall to earn the title match, the stage was set for later that night in the main event. Just as he did for Lex Luger about a year earlier, Hogan put Goldberg over like $1 million, even allowing him to kick out of several leg drops of doom, before Hogan became next as Goldberg jackhammered him and claimed the WCW title to the delight of his hometown crowd. It was a brilliant moment for WCW that showed off the fresh new path the company could have gone down. A lot's been made about the choice to run the match on TV instead of on pay-per-view, but as I've talked about in the past, it was still probably the best option they could have run at the time. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if WCW was back on the right track. Had they stayed the course and invested in their new champion, things could have ended differently. But they didn't, and that's why we exist in this timeline. Nevertheless, Goldberg's victory over Hulk Hogan is my pick for the best moment in WCW Nitro history. But what do you think belongs on the list? Did we seriously miss that many good things about this show? Let me know in the comments. Of course, for an anniversary as auspicious as this, there's no way I'm just going to focus on the good parts of Nitro. That's why next week I'm going to give you another top 8 featuring the 8 worst moments in Nitro history. There's a lot to pick from this time, folks, but until then, I'm Zane, and I'll see you next time.